detail cycle was selected, that being the Family Support Center. So I won't go into detail too much on those findings. They're also included in this report. But those are within here. And at that point, the group discussed what would be the second cycle to be detail tested for the fiscal year. And it was concluded that buildings and grounds would be looked into with a little more detail. So as we move through this document, it will kind of walk us through how the year's procedures went. So flipping through, it starts off with a letter from us. It basically states what the purpose of this report is and the role that we play to the district. It's really just to help you assess risk within what the district considers your significant financial transaction cycles at the district. As you move on, pages 1 and 2, really it's an overview and a scope of the whole internal audit process together. It explains how it starts off with an overall risk assessment of each of those 14 cycles. And there they are listed right there. Thanks, John. Essentially, those cycles were concluded on with us and the district. So we take a look at all of those during the risk assessment phase. And that was completed back in fall. And basically, members of our firm reach out to the appropriate personnel for each of those cycles and revisit not just their policies and procedures and the different processes that are handled in each of those. We get updates to see, were there any changes throughout the year? And we update, typically it's like in a narrative form, and we identify and pull out what the key controls, the internal controls are within each of those different cycles. Also, during the risk assessment phase, we take a look at, were there any prior year findings or recommendations that have been communicated to the district, and ask what's the current status of those. So have they been addressed, or do those previously identified risks still exist? So page 1 lists the 14 different items. Move on to page 2. After the overall risk assessment, we gathered information about each of those 14 cycles, and we assess an impact and a likelihood rating, and then put it together in this matrix, which helps segregate the cycles into different risk categories. So it sort of presents all the significant financial transaction cycles of the district by a rating, a risk rating, which might steer you to select those for detailed testing during the internal audit, or at least know which cycles really pose a significant impact if something were to occur where a deficiency in a control exists. So along the vertical axis, you see the impact. Basically, if something were to occur, how impactful would it be? Something like IT and payroll and personnel, those are your only ones that made it into the red or the high risk category. And that's not due to the current controls in place. It's strictly due to the size and the impact that it would have if there were a problem in that area. So along the horizontal axis, there's a likelihood, and that starts to play into, okay, not just the inherent nature of the cycle, but how are those controls at Kenton School District itself? And as you see, we don't have any that resulted in a conclusion of a high likelihood. That's evident and descriptive, really, of the district as a whole. I included it in my email communication before. Overall, we're definitely impressed with the condition of the financial control cycles at the district. So this groups them all into some risk categories on impact and likelihood. Moving on to page 3, we get into the actual results of the year. So it takes those 14 cycles And it's going to summarize whether we had any recommendations in that area. And further, if there were recommendations, we assess a criticality rating and a timeline to each of those recommendations. So as you can see, there's a lot of dashes here, which means we didn't have many current or new year findings. As a result of the risk assessment, that early procedure where we do a review over all 14 cycles, the IT cycle was the only one that resulted in a recommendation. The other two areas that had recommendations this year were those two cycles that were detail tested in buildings and grounds and the family support center. So the criticality rating, basically we're saying how urgent of a matter do we think it is that the district takes some action in addressing that recommendation. If it's something that we think should be done, it's of the utmost importance, it's going to receive an urgent criticality rating. If it's something that could benefit the district, but there aren't really any scary consequences if you don't do it, that's going to receive a routine side. The timeline is really how quickly do we believe the district should respond to any recommendation. Short term, we would expect to have it addressed or commented on within a year. In a long term, we would recognize this isn't something that you can turn around, at the snap of a fingers. It's going to take a developing plan to get through addressing that particular finding. That would carry a long-term timeline. So that's the summary. In total, there were four recommendations to be included in the report this year. As I had mentioned, one of them came from the overall risk assessment on IT, and then the remaining three were amongst the two detail tested. So we can move on to page 4, and that's where we get into the individual recommendations with a little bit more detail on what was covered. The first finding that's included here is under the buildings and grounds cycle, and this is really the first time that this group has gotten to speak on this. It boils down to not so much, or not at all, any deficiency in what's happening within the department. It's more so on the transparency side of things and in the practice and proactive mindset of planning ahead and making sure you're prepared in the event something were to happen. Everybody would continue getting their jobs done and you wouldn't skip a beat. We would like to see some documented policies and procedures for the department. So while we were satisfied, like I said, Tim Ames, he does a fine job over there and he has a lot of good processes in place, but in his absence, those items might not get carried out the same way. So we're really just stressing it. It's not fun being the person to say, hey, you should write that down and take it to the board so that it's formalized. But there really is some value to it. And it actually kind of relates to one of the comments that was discussed at the last meeting about the Family Support Center, and that's succession planning. So essentially a big benefit of having documented policies and procedures is that you're going to have that easier transition from one staff to the next. And there's going to be, duties are going to be accomplished no matter who's doing it. Are there any questions specifically on that? Like I mentioned, it was more just an overarching theme to document it and get it written down so that you get the knowledge out of Tim and make sure that you get the benefit of those policies and procedures for the day that he doesn't show up to work, or he wants to start passing on responsibilities to other staff. You have something in place that's going to make it much easier. All right, moving on to the next page. These I'll just summarize briefly as they were discussed at the last meeting. Let me know if you had any specific questions on it. But the first item carries a criticality rating of important, which is that medium criticality rating, and a timeline of long term. And really that's surrounding the opportunities to get grant money for the Family Support Center. We noticed that in past years, there were some significant grant funds coming in, and that was, assisting the center accomplish its mission and its operations. And lately, there didn't seem to be anybody assigned the task of searching for any grant opportunities and making sure that if there are funding opportunities out there, that the Family Support Center could capture those and realize the benefit from them. As you can see in the district response and status, the district, they said they were going to hire a grants management company to perform this job function. Essentially, the staff that was hired at the district, this was something outside of their realm, or they didn't have the capacity or the time to do it. John, is there any update on the progress? I know it's kind of a tough time to note any new progress in something like this, but did you have a comment?
So not specific to the Family Support Center, we have a grants management company that we've hired to take care of a lot of these grant opportunities, but we're still researching those that would be specific to family support. But we've also been able to take advantage of other grants for like school safety and training and things like that. So it's on the list for sure.
Great. The other item regarding the Family Support Center, we actually assessed with an urgent criticality, and that's sourced from noting that the director of the center, they had notified the district that they're going to be retiring at the end of the fiscal year. And similar to, they're sort of at the tail end, it's an urgent matter at the Family Support Center that they transition the knowledge from the current director. Whereas in buildings and grounds, you have a little bit more time, or we hope, with the current department head over there before you have to do that. So we noticed that and thought it made sense to bring up the recommendation to essentially get a succession plan in place. And the district responded just about as best you can do. They made it so that a staff could come in and be cross-trained by the director, and the current director would be able to stay on in a part-time capacity for another 2 years. So that's, almost invaluable to be able to have somebody with so much institutional knowledge be the person training the person, their successor, coming in to fill their shoes, rather than just have policies and procedures to follow. They're going to have policies and procedures, and they're going to get taught by the person who put them together. So really a best case scenario there. The final item on the last page, page 6, is that item regarding IT. This we thought was really just a comment of the times. And, we've seen the vulnerability of municipalities and school districts, really anybody who has valuable data. They're subject to cybersecurity risks, really, safeguarding data. And while the district had, really sound IT policies and procedures, we just wanted to bring a fresh look at the training that's being provided to the staff at the district on how to avoid potential threats through cybersecurity, and then B, in the event something did happen, is there a protocol to follow and they know what to do? So it seems pretty simple, but it's one of those things, if someone's trained how to put out a fire in their oven, it's not an issue. If they're not trained, you could have the house burned down. So just something that we wanted to put in. It's pretty easy, but we thought it was valuable information. We've actually communicated a similar comment like this at our other internal audits, as well as some external audits too. But that summarizes the report for the 1920 fiscal year. It went pretty well, all things considered. I mean, we got all of this work accomplished before the COVID pandemic set in, so we were able to get through it no problem. Did anyone here have any comments or questions on the report?
No, I don't have any. I thought it was very, very well-written report.
Excellent.
The cybersecurity comment is very timely. I'm in IT, so I tell every one of my customers that exact same security risk. I do have a question maybe for John. Does Winnie Rick or Erie One BOCES provide employee cybersecurity training for you?
So we subscribe to a training service through our insurance carrier, Nicer, and they have a module for cybersecurity training. So we haven't necessarily implemented that as mandated in the past, but that's something we'll do as part of the annual trainings that our employees go through each year at the beginning of the year.
Okay.
I mean, that's a great resource to have something that you don't have to come up with from scratch. Another item that we typically accomplish at this meeting is we start the discussion about what cycles the group may, rate at a higher risk or may be of concern for detailed testing during the next fiscal year. Given where everyone's been the past few months, that might not be the best timing. It might be drawing some attention to areas, and they're at the forefront right now. If you want to mention them now, I could take down notes, but it might be best to postpone that discussion, for a later meeting date. I'm not sure, Art or John, or if the group, you have comment on that.
I would say from a management perspective, I don't know that we've, I think typically we would say something like buildings and grounds would be a good area to look at, but we just looked at that and has proven that our policies and procedures are pretty strong. Mm-hmm. And we already have those policies and procedures in terms of like sanitation, and we're working on coming back to school and what that looks like and following all the executive orders from the governor in terms of really getting prepared and making sure people are safe. So I think at this time it would probably be beneficial to wait until our next meeting so we have an opportunity to kind of see how the next few months play out.
Right. Very good.
Okay, I appreciate that. Very, very good presentation, Carl.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Carl.
Okay, you have a good one.
All right. Take care, and just give me a shout when you want us to hop in the next meeting. Hopefully it'll be in person. And we can get a discussion going for the next fiscal year.
Sounds good. Appreciate it.
All right. Take care, guys. Thank you.
See ya.
Yeah. Let's see. Hey, Dave, do you have any questions or feedback relative to the report you just saw?
No, not other than what I've just already asked.
Okay.
And Dave, I'll show you too, just so the group can see. For our internal audit, we keep a running list of the responses and what we've done to address those. So I typically distribute this. I don't know if I have yet to the audit committee, so I'll make sure to send this out. But it really is every single thing that the internal auditors have recommended. We have a response or some kind of action plan to address those. And sometimes there's just things that we can't accommodate. One of the recommendations was to put a fire suppression system that's updated in our data center. That's something we would love to do, but it's a huge capital expenditure. So that's something, we can't necessarily do now, but look to accomplish, down the road. So I'll make sure to distribute this document to the group so everybody has an updated version. But I know, Dave, you're new to the committee, so I just want to bring this to your attention that this is really how we keep track of progress with our internal audits and those recommendations that come forth.
Okay, so they're typically like this once a year where they make these, like, what was this, about four recommended areas?
Right, so this year has been one of our lighter years comparatively. So we usually have maybe like more about 6 or a little more. But as these internal audits keep going each year to year, hopefully we improve. So there's less to find. So that's really what we've been seeing lately, is that we've been taking these recommendations seriously, implementing them into our practice at the district, and therefore the auditors are finding less and less. So we're never going to be perfect, but there's always an opportunity to improve. So that's kind of what this running document represents, is kind of our progress through and the status of each recommendation that they've brought forth.
So this group here, is this how internally everything is set up?
Yep. So
with the auditors, they kind of group things together.
So that's just a list of all the cycles that we typically can choose from and that they typically audit. So this committee here really decides what are going to be the next cycles, and what a cycle is just really what they focus on. So they'll focus on 1 or 2 subject areas pretty intensely, and then just kind of have a general audit of internal policies, controls, and procedures. So for instance, we chose buildings and grounds and the family support center for this year. So Drescher Malecki really dove into those 2 departments where they still kind of have everything else in the periphery, but they really focus on 2 cycles at once. So for our next meeting, we'll look to identify 2 other areas that really should be focused on by the internal auditors for the 2021 internal audit. So it's an annual process.
So all the categories make sense to me except extra classroom. What does that mean?
Extra class,
physical layout?
No. That's extra classroom or the student activity funds. That's a better known term. It's really all of the student funds that are run by teachers and students, like the student class fund or something like that, to like raise funding, or they have clubs or things like that. So it's an opportunity for students to really learn bookkeeping and things like that. But extra classroom funds show up all the time on our internal and external audits, and that's not unlike any other district in the state of New York. It's just when you have people who aren't trained in finance, managing books, there's always something that comes up in the reconciliation of checks or books or things like that. So you'll see that in our next presentation coming up here in just a moment with our external audit, which is just a strictly financial audit that happens annually.
Okay, so if a teacher collects money for a trip or something, they send it to the district office, and then you use internal controls to like keep it in a separate account. That's what that means.
Right. So we have student activity funds and different clubs that are set up with a central treasurer at each building. And then those treasurers keep note of all the transactions for each individual club or student activity account. And then that comes back to us. So there's oftentimes, the start of the year, we're doing really well, and then we forget to mark down invoices and POs and stuff like that throughout the year. So there's like reconciliation issues that we have to work through. So those are the kinds of things that we are up against every year.
Okay.
All right. So I have Mary Young in the waiting room from Lumsden McCormick. I'll bring her in now. Hi, Mary. Looks like our audio is connecting. Can you hear us? Oh, it looks like you're on mute. There you go.
I'm unmuting.
All right. How's it going?
Good. How are you guys?
Doing wonderful. Everyone. Surviving? Yeah. So for those that don't know, this is Mary Young from Lumsden McCormick. She's going to be presenting tonight on just some preliminary looks at our external audit. Mary, I think you're familiar with everybody in this room. Dave, except for Dave Stinner, maybe he's a new member to our audit committee. This is his first meeting with us, so he's just kind of getting his feet wet with the whole process.
Okay, great. And John, they have a copy of the presentation?
Yes, and I'll share it on my screen as well.
Okay, great. That sounds perfect. You ready for me to get started?
Yeah, Art, are we okay to move forward?
Oh, absolutely.
All right, let me just find it in my hundreds of windows on my computer here. Here we go. All right.
There we go. Perfect. Yeah, like John said, this is the required preliminary meeting with the audit committee prior to the start of the audit. And then we'll, of course, be meeting with you after the audit's finished. So if you go to the second page, just a reminder of our responsibilities and what we're delivering to you. You will receive a financial statement that's been audited under generally accepted auditing standards, government auditing standards, and then also the uniform guidance, which is the requirement because you receive over $750,000 worth of federal funds that we're required to test some of those funds. So there'll be that testing as well. And the purpose is to express an opinion on the financial statements. That includes each major fund, the fiduciary funds, and then the district as a whole. There is required supplementary information and supplementary information. The required supplementary information isn't audited, but we do perform limited procedures on the management's discussion and analysis and the pension and OPEB schedules that are in your financial statements. And then there's also supplementary information, which is required by SED, which includes the general fund budget and its correlation to the 4% calculation, the property tax levy cap, capital projects, and then the single audit or uniform guidance schedules. And then we will provide a management letter with any recommendations we have, and then also a communication with those charged with governance letter, which is required under the auditing standards. So the timing, we're having this meeting today, and then we have the final field work scheduled for 2 weeks. It starts the week of August 10th. Drafts will be available by the end of September, and then the audit committee meeting will schedule that as we get close to the point of the drafts being finished, and we'll schedule that with you. We are going to be doing a mix of field work remotely and in person. What we're envisioning now and what we've had preliminary discussions with John and Jean in the business office is kind of a mix of that. You know, maybe we come out to the district for a day or two, keeping socially distant practices in mind, and then also work remotely, scan, you know, having things uploaded electronically and things like that. The audit plan and our audit approach is similar to last year and other audits that we do. We try to take a risk-based look at the audit and an entity-wide focus. As I said earlier, we do have an opinion on the financial statements for the district as a whole. We update the understanding of operations and your objectives. That includes this year any changes relevant to COVID-19 or the CARES Act legislation. There will be some assistance or some CARES Act and other assistance for COVID that will come in the 2021 year, which I'll get into in a second. And then we also update our understanding of the processes in place to address the any identified risks. We assess the fraud and audit risk, and then we design procedures around that. And then we have continuous communication with management. Usually we have, not usually, but every year we have in our office day-long training and planning seminar where we talk about school districts and how we're going to affect the school district. You know, how we're going to handle school district issues and how we're going to set up our testing. So that'll happen in the beginning of July before our school season starts. The major areas that we look at are revenue, state aid, property and sales tax, any receivables or unearned revenue that there might be as a result of that. Your capital projects, any property or equipment purchases that you have, and the related payables and debt associated with that. You do have your 2014 capital improvements project, which is probably pretty close to winding down this year. And then also your Smart Schools Bond Act project. Those were the two projects that you had last year that probably transitioning over into the 1920 year. We take a look at your payroll, compensated absences, pensions, and OPEB liabilities. If there's any commitments or contingencies, so for instance, if there's any construction commitments associated with those capital projects, or any contingencies, any litigation matters that you might have that might need to be disclosed. And then, as I said before, the uniform guidance, there's additional federal funds that'll be coming through Education Stabilization Fund money, which will be recorded in 2021. There's also SED has also The federal SED has taken back a portion of your state aid, and the federal government under the CARES Act will be basically reimbursing you or making you whole for that. And that will also be in the 2021 year. There's the movement of school lunch funds into the summer food service program. So that's not a big difference because it's all within one school lunch cluster, but there will be some different numbers there in different categories. And then FEMA grants, which John and I and Jean talked about last week, they are accounting for and tracking any costs associated with COVID that they can ask FEMA for reimbursement for. So there'll be some of that. Again, that'll probably be in 2021. And then extra classroom activities, there is a report that we do on your extra classroom activities, and we typically pick 3 or 4, maybe 5 clubs, which have a little bit more activity than others. We kind of cycle through them each year, so we're not always picking the same ones, and just test for procedures, proper procedures, backup documentation of payments, and deposits are made timely and things like that. So we'll work on that one as well. An audit is designed to place an opinion on the financial statements. We can't look at every transaction, and we have to have a cutoff somewhere. So we work with materiality. So the example I have here is on a district-wide basis, if we took your total assets and your deferred outflows of resources, and we took 2% of that number, we get down to our planning materiality. That helps us to decide or to zero in on some of the more important or riskier areas. And then from there, we take 75% of that number, and that gives us an amount that the financial statements would not be materially misstated if the amount was under that, if there was an adjustment for an amount under that. And then even then we drill down to a trivial amount or past journal entry amount that we look at to make a decision on whether or not we think the adjustment needs to be made or not. And then we, of course, have these conversations with management. Couple accounting standards that are coming up. GASB 84 on fiduciary activities. This was actually supposed to be implemented this year, June 30th, 2020. But with COVID, GASB made the decision to postpone it till 2021. This is a requirement to look at the items that had traditionally been included in your trust and agency account. That would include scholarship activity, extra classroom activities, and then also payroll withholdings. It requires the district or the entity to take a look at these transactions, determine who has control over them, who has a say over what happens with them, and then determine if they should continue to be recorded in trust and agency or move to another fund, whether that be the general fund or a separate fund. We will be having discussions with management about that. We've taken a look at a lot of the extra classroom policies for our school districts. We audit about 30 school districts, and we've taken a look at the extra classroom policies for those districts and just determined if the principal or someone else in the district is the one making decisions, or is it really based on the faculty advisor and the students? Because that could have an effect if your scholarship activity is actually within like a trust that can only be used for certain things, and the people who donate the money are the ones who make the decision. Those are the types of things that we need to look at to implement that accounting standard. Then there's another one, GASB 87 for leases, and this is taking a look at any leases that you might have, as long as they're material, that are for a length of time over 12 months. And it's basically capitalizing them on a government-wide basis. This also was delayed. It was supposed to be implemented next year. Now it's implemented in 2022. This would affect for the district your any leases that you probably have with BOCES. We need to take a look at those and see how that affects it. GASB 92, the Omnibus 2020, this basically just takes a look at all the GASBs that had recently been implemented and kind of looks at the recording and the disclosures of those GASBs and tries to basically just work out any kinks or inconsistencies every once in a while after GASB implements a few different standards. They kind of take a look at them as a whole and see if there's any tweaking that has to be done to them. And that's usually in one of these omnibus standards. And then we have GASB 95, which basically just talks about the postponement of all those other GASBs and that, based on COVID-19. And the Financial Accounting Standards Board, which is the standards for other entities, they're doing a lot of this postponing as well. So it's not just the government accounting standards that are being postponed. Then we can take a look. We always have our, as I mentioned, we have our required communications letter that we will give you at the completion of the audit. That just talks about management's responsibilities versus the auditors, independence, the estimates that are included within your financial statements, any new accounting principles that would be implemented, we would disclose those. Any material uncorrected adjustments or misstatements, any difficulties we encountered, any significant internal control weaknesses, and any other matters that may come up. And obviously, if we do see any of this during the audit or prior to the audit, we would reach out to management or to the audit committee or the board to discuss anything of a serious nature that might come up. And then here's our contact information. John Chavone's the partner responsible for the engagement. I'm the manager. So you have our information should you want to reach out to us. Does anyone have any questions?
But you, Steve? Or David, would you have anything that you would like Mary to clarify?
Well, I just have a question on that metric of total assets and deferred outflows.
Mm-hmm.
So that is all the balance sheet assets and all the expenses put together in order to come up with the range of the 5%. Is that how?
It's the total assets on the balance sheet. This is looking at on a government-wide statement basis, not on a fund basis. It's the total assets, which would include your property and equipment. And then the deferred outflows of resources are items that are asset-like, but GASB doesn't like to call them assets. So they're called deferred outflows of resources. And that would include anything having to do with timing of things like your pension and your other post-employment benefits. There's due to timings and changes in valuations and interest rates and some actuarial assumptions, you could end up with basically an asset for part of the part of those disclosures. So they're basically all the asset items on a government-wide basis. And we're using this as an example. We do this for each fund. So for instance, in the general fund, we might use assets or we might use revenue, depending on which is higher. And then we start with that as our base. And then we take 2% of that number to get to our planning materiality, which helps us look at which categories we want to focus on an audit. So for instance, if you have prepaid expenses that are $50,000, but your materiality is $500,000, it really doesn't make sense to take a look at that $50,000 amount. And then we further drill down to tolerable misstatement, which is 75% of the planning materiality. And that helps us to determine which individual transactions we might want to look at. So looking at it from the slide we're looking at right now that looks at the government-wide basis, these are big numbers. And the reason why they're big numbers is because it includes your fixed assets, which is all of your property, all of your buildings, all of your construction projects that have been capitalized over the past however many years. So it's a big number. Did I answer the
I
question?
understand the deferred outflow now. I get that.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Any other questions, David?
No,
Okay. Mary, really appreciate the presentation. I thought it was very, very well done.
Oh,
And
thank
look
you.
forward to the upcoming audit.
Okay, well, again, if you have any questions, anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out.
Thanks,
Okay.
Mary.
Okay, thanks.
Hey, thank you. You have a
Take
good
care,
one.
everyone.
Okay, I thought they both did a very good job. What do you think, John?
Agreed. They always do.
All right, I guess we're at the point then where you would, let's see, Treasurer Malecki report would be forwarded on to the board.
Yes.
Okay. And I forget, do we have to make a recommendation that it's accepted, or it's just forwarded on?
It can't hurt. I would make a recommendation that it's accepted.
Okay, yeah, if you could put that together in the cover letter, that would be great.
Yep.
All right, then taking a look at the agenda for today. I think the other thing any other old business we should be discussing?
Nope.
Okay. All right, then I think we're talking about our upcoming meeting dates. I think if you would, we meet every other month on the Monday. If you would just verify is it going to be the first Monday or second Monday, and shoot that out, that would be beneficial.
Yep. I'll pass it along to everybody over email and get verification, and we'll set those dates.
Okay, that sounds good to me. And then I guess we've got a new Jill's resigning now, or not running
Yep,
for
well,
re-election.
She is not. So we'll have to have another board member appointed. Usually they're appointed to a committee every year. So it may be Andrew and somebody else, or maybe two new members. So we'll wait and see until they decide that in July, I believe.
Okay, no, that sounds good. And did you hear anything from Steve Brooks?
Like what?
Are you there?
Right here.
Oh, okay, then I guess we did hear.
Yeah, he's right there.
I don't think Art has the screen that shows all the gallery view.
Okay,
no.
yeah. Steve's been here the whole time.
Okay.
He has
There we go.
the view where only the speaker is shown on his iPad.
Gotcha.
Gotcha.
All right. Anything else we should be discussing? And I think we ought to adjourn, and I appreciate everybody participating in the meeting.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I'll make sure to get all the documents we discussed out in the next week or so.
All right, sounds great.